Our role is to be stewards of discovery, to ensure the next generation inherits not only the knowledge we have built, but the spirit of inquiry that drives us forward. Those are the words of President Thomas Rosenbaum of Caltech. So how are American universities the stewards of discovery, also the stewards of American exceptionalism? Why is curiosity-driven research a bedrock of American innovation and competitiveness? I'm your host, Navin Girishankar, and today I speak with Thomas Rosenbaum, the 9th president of Caltech. President Rosenbaum, delighted to have you here, sir. Thank you for joining Betting on America.
Thank you, Navin. It's a great pleasure to join you.
You're one of our country's most distinguished scientists, and you've led one of our most important high institutions of higher learning over the last 12 years in Caltech. Can you start with your journey, how we connect the dots between your early years as a physicist all the way to leading Caltech?
Sure thing. I really was inspired to go into science by the Apollo moon mission. This was a time, of course, when science was very much on the national radar, and it was tough, it was engrossing. And I remember lying on the living room floor on July 20th of 1969 as Apollo 11 landed on the moon, just being transfixed. And I found out later that I enjoyed tinkering. I liked putting things together in the laboratory. And the joy of discovery is remarkable. It's not always the Archimedes moment where you jump out of the bathtub and yell, "Eureka, I found it, I found it." But there is something special about trying to understand how nature works and then finally getting to the point where maybe you actually understand something deeply and in a way that others do not. And you always hope it's important. It may not always be, but it's a way to contribute to the bank of human knowledge. The administrative part's a little more complicated. I can't admit that I had any grand plan to go in that direction. As my favorite philosopher Yogi Berra says, if you come to a fork in the road, take it. And there were a number of such forks. And really the first serious one was being vice president for research and for Argonne National Laboratory, which was overseeing the national lab for the University of Chicago, which was the contractor for the Department of Energy. And my idea there was very specific, that there were opportunities for deeper connections and interactions between the university and the national lab system. Huge asset, the national lab system. And often universities are a little afraid of getting too involved in terms of being dragged in directions with much larger organizations. And so I thought, well, maybe there's an opportunity, particularly having come from Bell Labs, where that kind of interaction was pretty natural. The most serious change, though, really was becoming provost. And I took that job because I thought, wow, I have this great excuse to go talk to anybody, talk to people in the divinity school, talk to people in the business school. It was still at the University of Chicago, and learn from them and be broadened by them. And from there, it was natural to go become president of Caltech, which is a real hotbed of intellectual activity, very focused, different than the University of Chicago, but also highly idealistic about creating knowledge.
Phenomenal journey. And I take away from that it started, the spark that lit that was just the bold efforts of the United States in the 60s. And you think about what analogs there might be in this day and age, and how some young person today may be watching television and seeing something phenomenal in science and technology, and that might spark their career as well. And I just found that really quite inspiring. The other thing I would say is that you've got this parkour across private research, the national labs, Chicago, Caltech, the university system in the US, that is really very unique, and it gives you a perspective on the U.S. science and technology system that probably is hard to find elsewhere. And so I did want to jump on that and ask you, what makes our science and technology system so unique, so differentiating, and so attractive? Tell us, you've seen so many aspects of it.
Well, I think you framed it beautifully, Navin. I think the key word there is ecosystem. And America has a very special approach where you have the movement of ideas and people across various boundaries, where I think other places have not done that so well.
Yeah.
So you have universities, as you point out, dedicated to fundamental discovery, producing workforce that goes on, some in academia, a lot in industry. You have industry efforts which are complementary and pick up a lot of the ideas. And then you have a national infrastructure through the national labs. And you have, of course, boundaries here which are not always porous, but work reasonably well. And they need attention. But I think it's a mistake to think that these are all separate portions and that they can substitute for each other completely. The truth is somewhere in between. And we have to constantly work on making sure that that ecosystem is vibrant. So let me give you some examples to make this a little less abstract, perhaps.
Right. Yeah.
So the Nobel Prize in Physics this year went to John Hopfield, among two, for artificial intelligence. And the origins of that story was when John, who's a condensed matter physicist, wanted to think about biology and chemistry of the brain. He actually moved from Princeton to Caltech. And he was trying to bring different insights into the concept of actually how do neurons talk to each other, and came up with neural nets.
Wow.
Now, it turns out that this has not actually been that effective model of the brain per se. I mean, you could just say when you have artificial intelligence and machine learning, you're dealing with gigawatts. The brain is at 20 watts, so they're probably somewhat different processes. But that discovery keyed the whole development of machine learning, of the matrix manipulation that lays at the basis of large language models. But none of this would have really been realized for applications like large language models, except for industry pitching in, developing the chips, right? The famous rise of NVIDIA.
Right.
From games all the way now to a source of jobs and, we hope, prosperity for the United States. So we've run the gamut here where there's a pass off, and also the students that we're producing now are the ones who are going to Google and Microsoft and NVIDIA. Transistor, if I can go back to my Bell Labs days, is another good example there. So this, and if you've ever been to Murray Hill, New Jersey, which is where Bell Labs was in its heydays, the display of the first point contact transistor, which is this huge chunk of germanium. And it was the basic physics of semiconductors, but it was not done in vacuum in the sense that if you went to the cafeteria at AT&T Bell Labs, there was always up on the wall the stock price that day of AT&T. So you knew why you were working in these directions. And it, in fact, took many years to be able to translate this into applications that we see as the basis of modern electronics. In fact, one switched from germanium to silicon, as you know. One had to come up with the fundamental notions of what are design parameters. How do you go from one transistor to a billion transistors on a chip? That work was done at Caltech by Carver Mead. But then again, there's a pass off to industry. I'll give you one final example, if I may, which now involves national labs to bring into that. The synchrotron at Argonne National Lab is a mechanism to look at structures of proteins. Well, it's a mechanism to look at microscopics of many things, but one of the main applications has been a catalog of crystal structures of various proteins. And this tells you about the fundamental biology. But of course, biomedical companies can try to design drugs for diseases that depend on the structure of those proteins. And you can develop simulations based on those models to be able to figure out how proteins go from their native state into a folded state where they're functional. And coming full circle, that, of course, was the source of the Nobel Prize of Chemistry this year for AlphaFold.
Amazing. It's like just trying to wrap my head around that. Those examples are so inspiring, and I take away two things from that. One is that discovery is nonlinear. It happens, but then you pass off to the private sector. It throws up new questions, and it goes back to researchers, and it throws up new possibilities to people who are finding commercial applications. And there's like this back and forth and improvisational aspect to it that is really hard to replicate if you were to try and design it up front. And it's something that has evolved over God knows how many decades in the United States. And when you think of American exceptionalism, everything you said, like that's what's ringing in my head, American exceptionalism. Is that right? Do I got that right?
I think you put it beautifully, as usual. And I think improv is a great example because in improv, you're taught to say and, not but. And it really is the and portion here that we see so powerful in the American ecosystem.
Amazing. Now let's zoom into universities. You've led Caltech for 12 years. You talked, I read your quote at the beginning of the podcast. I found it inspiring. You described the university as the stewards of discovery, and that so many things, as you've described, flow out of that. And I'm just looking at many things that under your leadership at Caltech have been breakthroughs in gravitational waves, quantum computing, sustainable energy, gene editing, earthquake early warning systems, and so on and so on. What's the secret sauce?
Yes. Well, one thing is it's important to acknowledge that those discoveries were made by the people, the students, faculty, the staff at Caltech. And my role is relatively modest compared to that. But we do try to create an environment here where we attract really creative, original people, put them in an environment where they can interact, where there are very few barriers to that interaction. Caltech has a model which isn't like a lot of its peers in that we don't try to grow bigger, we try to get better. And that means that you're always trying to figure out where should you apply your resources. What are the focus areas have the greatest payoffs, either in fundamental knowledge or benefit to society? And then you have to decide if you're going to invest in one area where you're not going to invest. And I think that intellectual rigor is actually very helpful. The other part is we structurally want to be small because we want people to know each other, know what they're doing. We don't hire 10 people in one field. We try to pick big problems where we bring people with different perspectives together to be able to collaborate to get a different view or more holistic view of what the problem might be. Let me give you an example of a structural aspect of Caltech that's unusual. When you're a student and you apply as a graduate student to a particular major or option, you have to be admitted in that way. There are the disciplinary constraints. But when you get in, you now can work for any faculty member at Caltech. There's no bureaucracy associated with that. As long as somebody will take you on as their student, you're fine. So research groups here have computer scientists and mechanical engineers and biologists and chemists and physicists all sitting next to each other and working together. We also try to reduce barriers for changing fields. If you've been very successful in one field, the funding structure in the US is relatively conservative, and you wind up being pushed in some ways to continue in those directions. But you may find that there is another problem where your skills can be applied that may even be richer, may lead better results. And so we try to create the environment where we encourage people to make those kinds of shifts. So this is a kind of fearlessness that I think is intrinsic to Caltech's success.
Fascinating. Lots of lessons there for other research institutions, by the way. I'm taking notes here. I think you said before, the most profound insights often come from collaboration. And I think you're describing that in terms of the culture and the environment at Caltech, which really quite powerful. You also describe the environment you have there as yielding intellectual magic. And I just wanted to maybe ask you to give us a little bit of example. One of the examples I've read about is your work on new instrumentation and why that's important to encourage young researchers to take risks and take leadership in their research. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and why it's important?
Absolutely. And I'm a big enthusiast for this, so I'm grateful for you
Yeah.
bringing this up. There are not a lot of places that dedicate themselves anymore to trying to develop new ways to interrogate nature. But you open up new fields, new vistas when you're able to do that. You can pose new questions, which is why I think that it's important for exciting young people to get into the field. So a good example are optical telescopes. Caltech, since the early 1900s, has run the largest optical telescopes in the world. And if you can collect enough photons, sorry to be so physicsy, but if you can gather enough light from the universe, you can see things that nobody else has seen. You can, as Hubble did at Mount Wilson, find out that the galaxy is expanding, that the universe is expanding, our galaxy is moving, and all of a sudden your worldview is completely different in the kind of questions you can pose. And it is also a motivation to crossing these disciplinary boundaries that you were just talking about. So here's a great example. We're trying to develop the next generation of radio telescopes. So there are signals coming from the universe in the optical, of course, but also the radio spectrum. And some of those signals actually cut through the dust that block the optical signals. And the traditional way is to build bigger and bigger radio dishes. But in fact, there are limits to that, both in effectiveness and in cost. What happens now if you can take advantage of additional computational power and put 1,000 small dishes together, stick them up electronically, by software analyze the images, and now have a different view of the sky? And in fact, it's like phaser radar. You can scan the whole sky at once. So there are just new possibilities, which then bring together computer scientists, mechanical engineers, in this case, astronomers, and let you do something completely different. And it's the devotion then to actually building these things that I think makes it real. It's also true that the insights you gather from one field are applied to another. So, for example, these kinds of images, radio images, are what came together in the program to be able to look at the massive black hole at the center of our galaxy, at the center of the Milky Way galaxy. And you saw these famous images on the front page of the New York Times, among other places, which look like the Eye of Sauron. That came together from syncing various signals from radio telescopes around the Earth. You look at very large baselines, you can wind up getting much better sensitivity or resolution. But those same techniques that convert those signals into an image are the techniques that you can use to look at radiographs, mammograms, and try to detect breast cancer. So it's the same problem, different application. And so developments in one can then influence developments in another, and you may be enriched as a human being by looking at the black hole in the center of the galaxy. But as a patient, you may now have your life saved by the fact that you can do better image reconstruction using AI.
The spillovers from curiosity-driven research into all aspects of life, the economy, society, medicine, is something that cannot be underestimated, and in fact is one of the core elements of American exceptionalism as it has been experienced over the last 100 years, maybe longer. So let me now go to the university again, because you've been very articulate about describing the free movement of people and ideas as a backbone for American innovation. And we're in a very unique moment now with universities where there is a genuine tension, and I would say really a difficult moment in some ways, between the commitment long term to openness. At the same time, I would say concerns, if I'm taking the Steelman version of this, research security and national security. How do we balance these? We see this playing out in different places. Today, Secretary Rubio announced that he would be withdrawing visas from Chinese students who are members of the CCP or those who are working in critical fields. Similarly, there are questions around Harvard's ability to enroll international students. How do we manage these tensions or think about these tensions, particularly from where you sit?
Yeah, so let me start with the point you raised about research security. And then maybe, so you've touched on a lot of different subjects.
Yeah.
There's the whole issue of immigration, and
Right.
then there's the issue of, if you will, the efficiency of basic research. And yeah, I can try to touch on some of those, and obviously push me on the ones where I've not fully addressed your questions. So for research security, I think it is naive to think that there are not powers out there that want to take our discoveries and use them for themselves and will engage in nefarious ways to obtain that information. So that is the threat, and we have to be cognizant of that threat. And universities, I think, try to approach this in a number of different ways, and government can help. One way is that we insist on complete disclosure on those kinds of connections, affiliations of foreign entities, monies received, and so on. And we have to be diligent about that. And when we identify that, if it does pose a threat to what we do, then we need to act and we need to forestall that. And I think it's fair to say that most universities are very attentive to this. I meet with the FBI, for example, and get briefings on these sorts of things. And it's an important aspect.
Yeah.
I think the government can help in terms of clarity of the expectations. Right. So going back to Ronald Reagan in 1985, there's the famous NSDD, National Security Decision Directive 189, which talks about the distinction between classified and unclassified research. And there's a sharp line between those.
Yeah.
We, in fact, in universities do not do, to large part, classified research. So as long as we have those stipulations and there aren't gray areas, which are confusing if we have liabilities, but if one can draw sharp lines about areas we can work in, areas we can't, that's very helpful. I would say finally that there is a danger here of throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
Right.
The secret of success of the American system has been this rapid pace of discovery. And this rapid pace of discovery requires exchange of ideas. And so you can put up walls, and that works and worked not too badly during the Cold War with the Soviet Union because we were technologically superior. I would argue now that we are not technologically superior in many areas to the Chinese. And other countries that we compete with. And we do ourselves harm if we destroy the parts of our system that give us the competitive advantage. So we have to get that balance right. So the openness and security, but I think clarity is useful, diligence on the behavior of universities, but also honoring what has made us so good. In terms of the efficiency of basic research, I think there's here one has to talk about risk and failure.
Yeah.
Basic research, if it's really going to be effective, has to accommodate a certain amount of risk, ideas that aren't going to work, experimentation. And if everything succeeds, your risk profile is probably not the right risk profile.
Right.
But failure in that sense makes things look less efficient. But again, if you're pushing the envelope in this fashion, you want to be able to assume those sorts of risks. And in fact, it's why basic research tends to be done in universities and not in industry.
Yeah.
Because industries are for profit, universities are not for profit.
Yeah.
And we accommodate that kind of risk. We de risk things and then pass them on to industry, which isn't to say that, I mean, industry does amazing things and there's always risk. But when you want to start betting on it, you'd like some de risking. And so it's this connectivity, it seems to me, that's really important. I think the other part to realize is the gestation period is very long.
Yeah.
And uh, I can give you another example, again, which is less theoretical, perhaps,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
than this discussion, which is we've been working for a decade now on a project on space-based solar power. So the idea is, could you collect sunlight in space when it's 24/7 and beam it back to Earth? So now there's no interruption, right? Part of the
Mm-hmm.
problem in terms of solar power is it only shines during the day or when there's sun out.
Yeah.
And so you have to store the information. You have to develop, store it. You have to store the energy.
Yeah.
You have to develop the infrastructure to deliver the energy from where it is to somewhere else. You have to develop batteries that are more efficient. Now,
Yeah.
if you just collect it in space and beam it down, say through microwaves, then you could deliver power where you want it 24/7 and not invest in this incredible infrastructure. So we actually did a demonstration at Caltech of this with really lightweight structures because it's expensive to launch things in space.
Yeah.
Converted the solar power with radiation hardened solar cells into microwaves, beamed it down to the top of the Moore Engineering Building, named after Gordon Moore,
Yeah.
on the Caltech campus. Now it was a tiny amount of power, right? So it was
Yeah.
a proof of principle. And to make this commercially viable, which we'll see if it's possible or not, will take many more years. But at that point, if you want to scale this and have solar farms, lightweight structures which are kilometers across, this is not what a university does.
Right.
This is what industry is going to have to do.
Right.
And
Right.
but that can take decades.
Yeah.
Just like MRI machines took decades after the discovery of nuclear magnetic resonance, which came out from the radar lab at MIT or the folks working there.
Yeah.
And understanding this long time period, I think, is part of the confusion and maybe suspicion about the efficiency of investments in basic research in the university structure. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really helpful for framing where I wanted to go. It's just such a rich description. I appreciate that. Let's maybe break it down into a couple of different pieces. One has to do with the funding of basic research. And in particular, I wanted to get your thoughts on what is a longstanding issue now, which is as a share of GDP, public spend on R&D has been falling since the mid-60s. Now, of course, we had a different economy then than we do now. We have different competitors today than we did then. But nevertheless, public R&D has been falling as a share of GDP. Private R&D has taken over and has outpaced public and R&D. But it's an interesting debate because, you know, some people would argue that public R&D does more of the basic curiosity-driven research, the kind that you're describing with the long tail, all kinds of potential spillovers that you can't see right now. And private R&D, by and large, is very mission-driven, user-driven. It's not exactly the case. I'm being stylized here. But I'd like to get your thoughts on where we should be going as a country, because we are experiencing some important and deep cuts in public R&D. And I would like your thoughts on how we should approach this problem.
Yeah, I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask for efficiency and stewardship of government resources. I think in general that's right. But I think it has to acknowledge, as we were talking about, the risk profile and the success and failure rate.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that if you want to take a long view, you will have the most success. And to ask for a response on a quarterly profit basis or even a couple of years means that decades from now, the jobs that would come out from new industries are likely not to be there.
Mm-hmm.
The ideas that attract young people into science who are going to provide the workforce are not going to be there.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what we have at risk in
Yeah.
terms of shutting off the allocation of percent of GDP into fundamental research.
Yeah. I think this question I would have is, if you think of some of your top concerns about the cuts to the
Yeah.
federal cuts to R&D, to basic R&D, public R&D, let me frame it this way. What are your concerns about the long-term impact of cuts that we're making today on the S&T, the science and technology ecosystem? And do you think those are reversible?
Yeah, so that's a wonderful question, and I think there are many concerns. So let me try to distill them down to a few that I think are most urgent. The first one, as we've been talking about, is the risk profile. If you do not ask big questions, then you're not going to get big answers. You're not going to develop the industries of the future and the attractive aspects of science that motivate young people. And that requires a long-term investment. That is the second point. You talked about the fact of being inspired by the Apollo mission as well, and our discussion about that. Where are those long-term, big vision investments these days? I think they're fewer and far between. And so I actually worry a lot about that. It's something that's made America great. We've been one of the few places in the world that's been able to do this. Who else really could have gone and landed on the moon in that way? Who else could, if we decide to do it, pick up rocks off Mars that may have indications that life existed, microbial life existed on another planet? It changes the whole notion of humanity's place in the universe. And finally, people. If we do not have these inspiring projects, why will the brightest kids decide to choose science? Why will they be motivated to learn, put in all the hard work, and then contribute to society? And ultimately, it's all about people.
Yes, yes. Eloquently stated, sir. Eloquently stated. And I want to jump from that to a point you raised around lab to market transitions. So imagine a world in which we do have robust investments in basic research. There are still these, particularly for, I would say, capital-intensive technologies, concerns about a valley of death between lab to market. And this is a long-standing concern, particularly in critical and emerging technologies. You have been an advocate for what was then called the Endless Frontiers Act, but eventually CHIPS and Science. I had the opportunity when I was in government to work on that. I found it really quite inspiring that significant investments were being made in the R&D side of CHIPS. Similar ones are being made in other sectors. Tell us what we should be thinking of in terms of lab to market mechanisms. Assuming we're in a world in which investments are being made in basic research, there's still this other set of challenges in some areas. What should we be thinking about or doing in that respect?
Yeah, I think this is a question of barriers. And I think CHIPS and Science was an attempt to lower those barriers from the fundamental discovery into the applications or the translation into actual commercial products. And was inspiring. Of course, only part of the bill was funded, not the entire part.
Not the science part.
Not the science part, which has been discouraging. I would say, in a hopeful note, that what I find, certainly among young people, young researchers at universities, is that there is really an embrace of the notion that if they have great ideas and they can be translated into products that make people's lives better, that's really important to them. That's why they will come and choose this career. They will want to move back and forth on the spectrum of fundamental curiosity driven to the applied part. But that if you do not provide the resources to allow them to make that translation, they're unlikely to come and join your university or your organization. And so that the kind of investments that we have to make. We have to take early stage ideas and do proof of principles. We can do that at universities. We need to bring in business leaders who know how to form companies and identify markets. We have a program here, Entrepreneurs in Residence, that we want to do to be able to provide that guidance. Like anything else, that's a deep skill that you have to learn that you may not know how to do. We have venture funds, early stage, before round A, that universities run. MIT has a very elaborate program on this. Stanford, of course, has that. And then if you develop innovation centers and spin off companies, you want them to stay in the neighborhood, if you will, or at least some of them, to develop that ecosystem which attracts various industries. And then that interface, of course, is much smoother. So I can give you an example that we're trying now, which is new for Caltech, which is we have a partnership with Amazon Web Services. They built a building on our campus where they are using Caltech IP for quantum computers to actually see if they can build a commercial product. Now, we have 300 faculty members to give you a sense of our size. To do this effort, they've hired 100 or 150 quantum engineers. This is not something that we would do in terms of being able to support it. But this is a way that we can take our intellectual property and see if it has a chance to actually build a quantum computer with all the ancillary benefits for society. And I think we need more active models in terms of how we get our IP out there, how we reduce the barriers, again, to using that IP. These things can be complicated, but they should be solvable.
Let me ask you about impediments. We are in the midst of, I would say, a multi-front trade war of our own making. And when I think of a number of the critical and emerging technologies you've mentioned and that you have stewarded in your own way at Caltech, whether it's quantum or AI or chips, clean tech, biotech, all of these areas, each of these value chains are global in nature. And so when you have to price in a trade war or a tariff war, especially for those nascent industries like quantum, you might be shooting yourself in the foot. This is perhaps my editorial comment, but I did want to get your reaction to it because it's another piece of the ecosystem that we can't ignore.
Absolutely, and I agree. And the aspect of cost of goods, and look at rare earths, right? I mean, there's a great example. The whole electronics industry depends on that. And the world is a better place. That may sound a little naive, but it's a better place if there's availability of that to everyone. Now, there are realities in terms of international relations that have to be accommodated. But I fear, and so I'll put my editorial comment, that we are shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of the way that we're approaching this. And if I could loop back a little, I think is an important aspect of this is the brain drain aspect. If you're thinking about trade, if you will, or movement, it's movement of people. I mean, the United States is 4.5% of the world's population. It is not logical to believe that all the really smart people are going to be born in America. Clearly, there is talent from around the world.
Right.
And over the years, the United States has benefited enormously from the fact that really smart, creative people come to the United States to be educated, and then a lot of them stay here and become American citizens, American residents, and contribute to our nation. And I think the most serious aspects of the current policies is we could shut that off. In fact, we're going to see migration of really smart people from America to Europe and to Asia. And if you look at the history of this country, that is what has allowed us to compete. And I really hope that we will be able to keep an open atmosphere where we can take full advantage of the many skills that really creative individuals want to contribute to America's prosperity.
Eloquently stated, President Rosenbaum. the U.S. innovation system and science and technology innovation system has been a magnet for the rest of the world for many generations. And it's really something we are inheriting, and in a sense, we are called upon to preserve it if we want to preserve what is so unique about this country. So with that, let me say this is about betting on America. That's what the show is about. What are the things that give you hope and get you excited about what's on the frontier? What's coming that we should be excited about?
This is a fabulous time to be doing science. The questions are profound and the tools are amazing. And so there's a certain irony about talking about these constraints, but maybe it underscores the fact why investment continues to be important. So the fundamental question of, are we alone in the universe, which I touched on in terms of the rocks on Mars, but also has to do with exoplanets. We now know about thousands of planets orbiting other suns. And with the right tools, we should be able to interrogate their atmospheres and see if there are signs of life. We also can look deep back into time, far out in space, not only with optical and radio telescopes, but also now using gravitational wave detection. And this gravitational waves, along with electromagnetic spectrum, are the only two ways that information can travel across the universe at the speed of light. Mm-hmm. So we now have a completely new window. We can look at events like massive black holes colliding and merging. We can see neutron stars merging, which has given risen to all the heavy elements. So the gold and platinum on the Earth are the product of those types of collisions and also supernovae explosions. Mm-hmm. So we really are stardust. And we can figure out, in fact, how we became who we are in that fashion. Quantum entanglement, the second quantum revolution. So the electronics industry was based on the fact that they're discrete atomic levels that are manipulated in semiconductors. But now you should be able to encode information in ways that lead to sensitive new detectors, whether it's detecting brain waves or taking a bunch of entangled atoms, pouring them out of a test tube and seeing how they interact with the gravitational field of the Earth. That should lead to more sensitive detectors than radar. So there are all these possibilities that are on the horizon. If you think of biology, right, the applications now for medicine have been incredible. Think of the therapies that are available to us now as compared to our parents or our grandparents. Really astonishing, but there's so much more. When you talk about single cell biology and this, what we would call at Caltech the cellular connectome, take a tumor, grind it up, see what proteins and genes are there. Well, that gives you some information, obviously. But what happens if you could use AI and imaging to look at each cell, understand what proteins and genes are being expressed in each cell, and then create a three-dimensional image so you understand how the cells are communicating? Yeah. This may be why tumors, in fact, don't react to chemotherapy.
Wow.
Because outside cells are different, protecting the inside cells. If you could understand that, maybe you could penetrate those defenses and find another approach to curing cancer. So they're just extraordinary examples, I think, out there, which, keep us in the business.
An incredible time to be alive and an incredible time to be an American scientist. Thank you so much for that. President Rosenbaum, this has been very inspiring, and also you really give us pointers for what policymakers and what for people in universities should be the pathway forward. I really appreciate your taking the time today, sir.
Well, I really appreciate this podcast series and all you're doing to elucidate the issues. Thank you, Navin.
Thank you for joining this inspiring conversation with President Thomas Rosenbaum of Caltech. You can find this episode of Betting on America and more on CSIS.org, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is Navin Girishankar reminding you that everyone has a role to play in winning the tech race.